Hello, guys. Today we're going to be covering Module 1. This is just going to be a brief introduction to the course, what exactly consists of expository writing, and the importance of reading comprehension. As I mentioned in the introduction of this film, if you have not seen that, I highly encourage you guys to see it. It's just a brief overview of the syllabus, the Canvas, course shell, so that way you can understand where everything is. But I mean, I think it's pretty simple. But once again, if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to contact me. So if you have not seen the video, it's about 20 minutes or something. So I highly encourage you guys to see it, okay? In addition, this one, hopefully it's just as quick. It's just a simple overview of pretty much basic concepts that I'm sure you are aware with, you are already aware of. But the idea here is to bring you in kind of slowly because I do understand summer just happened. We're, dusting off those old academic books, right? And getting back to work. So this week is kind of hectic because I know people are deciding whether they want to keep the class, add the class, drop the class, etc. So this week is a little easier than the next upcoming week. So, but do be aware that you do have 2 assignments. You have a discussion question and you do have your reading comprehension assignment, okay? They're pretty easy. They can be found under Module 1, Week 1, which is in modules on your Canvas course shell, okay? So with that, let us get to lecture, okay? As I said, these are pretty much basic concepts here. It's not supposed to be something to like wow you so much, but the idea here is so we want to address them, make sure that it is all well and said, right? So what is expository writing? Expository writing is the type of writing that's just used to explain, describe, and give information. It assumes that writing is not merely a useful skill, but it's also a way of learning and knowing, right? It focuses on the examination of things like evidence, the development of ideas, and clear expression of those ideas in a variety of different kinds of essays, right? Usually in writing courses, students are going to routinely move from exploration to arguments. Then they evaluate various texts so that they can evaluate things like written, visual, and experimental types of writing. An idea here is to add to the plethora of your overall writing capabilities, right? The idea here is that as you advance in your career, both in your professional and academic career, we find that writing becomes more complex, right? And writing tasks become more difficult. And the idea here is expository writing, it makes it easier for you to communicate with your readers, right? Through the use of expository writing, you can be the most efficient and effective writer possible, right? With expository writing, you use things like evidence, details, and facts to support a given topic. And your overall main purpose is to present information in a balanced and detailed way. And the idea is to do it in an objective way, and to use your supporting evidence to clearly identify not only your thesis, but your overall argument, right? And why your argument is valid. So there are different types of expository writing. Oops, sorry, guys. Okay, so the reason why I like to include these is because, I mean, we're going to talk about these. You're going to find that a lot of these can be found in your assignments, but the idea here is this is like a possible test question, okay? As I mentioned in the introduction, you will be given 2 exams. They're going to be worth 50 points apiece. So more than likely, there's probably going to be, something maybe like 15 questions or 10 questions, depending, very basic questions. The idea here is just to help assist you so that way you don't have to worry so much about your writing and you can enjoy your assignments more, right? Because I know that when there's a lot of points that are assigned to an assignment, it makes it nerve-wracking, right? So an example of a potential question may be, which of the following is not a type of expository writing, right? Or I may say, writing that explains a problem and gives possible solutions would be classified as what? It'd be problem solution, classification, cause and effect. And we say, oh, problem solution, pretty much given in the definition of itself, right? So that's another example of that, okay? So let's just briefly go over these types of writing. You're going to have your descriptive definition writing. This is when the writer gives a complete explanation of the topic with evidence, examples, and background history. Descriptive writing is very good. especially when you're trying to do something like narrative or you're trying to inform the reader of something. Sequential, this can also be called a process essay. This is where the writer explains something in sequential order. So this would be also useful for narrative, right? So for instance, let's say you're telling a story. One of the assignments that we will be doing is called the narrative assignment, right? And the idea here is that you are going to tell me something about your background, right? So for the narrative essay, you can tell me, you can write an essay about the experience in your life that has had some type of significant effect on you. Normally, this experience should have caused you to learn something about yourself. And in order to effectively explain that to the reader, because I'm your reader, I'm your audience, right? You would want to go in sequential order. Tell me, what was it? Was it something from childhood? What did you learn from it? So on and so forth, right? Comparative. This is when the writer explains the differences and similarities between two topics or ideas. So as we can see here, compare and contrast assignment would be somewhat like this, right? The idea here is that you're finding 3 comparisons and 3 contrasting point of views, right? The idea is to do this in a objective manner, so that way the reader can make a decision for themselves. Cause and effect. This is when the writer focuses on something that focuses on the cause of something or the effects that something has or might have. So maybe like, let's see, it's not an essay that I've assigned for this class, but let's say that you did have something like that. It could be something to the extent of cause and effect of global warming, right? That would be an example of that. When we talk about problem and solution, this is a writing that explains a problem and gives possible solutions. Okay, so your research paper could be something that could be conducted around that, and we'll go more into details as we go on. Lastly, classification. This is when the writer puts information into groups and subgroups that supports the main topic. Okay. And once again, I'm not sure if you guys heard my dog barking. I want to apologize to you. She's a stickler. We just got her. We just adopted her. She's a rescue. So still trying to teach her how to use her voice, but in an effective way, in a quiet time. So once again, if you did hear a bark, I apologize. So building a brains bank. As students advance in their language learning and reading comprehension, we find that overall reading comprehension becomes easier, right? Because the idea here is that the more that you read, the more that you learn, okay? This is because each new word is being saved in your brain, almost like a brain bank, right? Hence the name. So, once again, I may ask you, what is a brains bank? That would pretty much be the definition right there, right? This is when you're connecting new knowledge with old knowledge, and it makes it easier to understand, right? So for instance, have you guys ever seen a movie, I don't know, like that you haven't seen in a very long time? An example of this would be, and I'm sorry, for all my lectures, I include just random tangent examples, so I apologize for this, but let's say like Clueless. That movie came out when I was little. And now that I'm an adult, I actually saw it maybe when like I said, I was a fan of it when I was a child, but then I just never saw it again. And then recently I saw it and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot about this film. But a lot of things that were pretty obvious, in the way that they spoke to one another, I did not catch as a child because once again, I was a kid and my brain's bank was not as extensive as it is now. Does that make sense? Right? The new terms and ideas that I've learned from not just reading, but conversations and experiences that I've had in life, now I can use those in my overall understanding of that film, right? That would be an example of that, right? So reading comprehension is important because it assists in developing a student's critical thinking and cognitive functions, right? So this can help with things like your overall attention, your verbal working memory, things like executive functioning, and your overall processing speed, right? So we all know the feeling of reading something repeatedly and not understanding its overall meaning, right? So this is the reason why reading comprehension is such an essential skill, because the idea here is that there's going to always be a word that you don't know, even as an adult, right? You think that you master it all, and then somebody comes out with something completely different. And so you're like, oh, where did that word come from? But the idea here is that you continuously allow yourself to be receptive and open to those new words. So an example would be, I don't know, I think I was talking to my sister and I said, I used the word ambulate, and she said, what is that? And I said, to move from a place, like to walk, right? And she said, oh, I've never heard of that word. I'm sure she's heard of that word, but it's almost like, have you guys ever bought a car? And let's say, I don't know, let's say you buy a Kia and you're not really, never bought a Kia before, but now that you've been introduced to the Kia, you feel like you see them everywhere. When you know they've existed, it's just that you've never really paid attention to it, right? So that would be the idea here, is that by opening yourself to the idea of these new words, understanding these new words, and creating that brain spank, you'll be able to recognize them a lot more, right? And therefore embed them in your overall vocabulary. That makes sense, okay? So, cognitive science have discovered that reading is incredibly complex and mutable, right? So good readers are going to connect the meaning of one sentence to another, hence the importance of a brain spank. They consider the meaning of singular words, but they can also deduce the meaning of those that they don't know by evaluating them in the overall context. And we're going to talk about tips that will be helpful for that, right? But one of the most crucial aspects is something called goal setting, right? This helps the reader focus on what is essential in the text when retaining that information that they need, right? So for instance, if you learn a new word, you may want to not only understand its meaning, but then use it, right? Because it's one of those things, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? And we're going to talk more about that as we continue on, right? So the main point of reading comprehension is for you to apply reading comprehension in not only in, for instance, the essays that you're going to be writing, but in your overall life, okay? So there's something called active reading. This is a way of reading that involves a deeper engagement with the text before, during, and after the reading. So the idea here is that you want to prepare, respond, and read critically. Often we just read something and we just kind of let it flow out of our memories, right? This happens all the time, right? You may read instructions on something and, maybe you've read it like 10 times, but every time you have to go back to it because it just doesn't want to stick in your brain, right? The idea here is that you're not reading critically. You're not really preparing your brain or your surroundings for you to take in that information, because we're like sponges, right? We need time to be able to suck it all up. If not, then, it's just a brief, we're briefly wet with this new knowledge, but then it dries all the way up, right? That'd be an example of that. Active reading is important because it involves reading with a purpose. You're asking questions, taking notes, engaging in the material, right? The goal of active reading is to understand and evaluate the text for the relevance that you need it for. So as I mentioned, there's steps you should want to take: prepare, respond, and read quickly. So how do you prepare? First, you want to identify the purpose. Why are you reading this? Is it because it's an assignment? Is it something that you want to learn? Is it a new topic of interest, etc.? Gain some background, right? So sometimes we may read something and not exactly understand what it is. So for instance, let's just take the example of the assignment given, right? We have Federalist 10, right? This is a Federalist paper. I don't know if anybody's aware, but Federalist papers were intended with the purpose of, particular writers were writing to each other with the purpose of arguing the importance of creating a government of accountability, right? So prior to the Constitution, so on and so forth, Federalist Papers was something that was written, right? And was written in secret. So this is an example of that, right? By giving you a little bit of background, maybe it can give you a little more interest into why you should want to read this. If you've never read the Federalist before, I highly encourage you to do so. It's such a great book overall. But once again, I'm going off on different tangents, so I apologize to you guys. All right. But just by giving a little bit of information about that, we can see why the Federalist Papers are so important, right? Because they're advocating for the federal government, right? So responding. Another thing that's also important to prepare is to skim the text, right? So often you may want to just take, a lot of times, for instance, if we look at a research paper, normally research papers have like an introduction. They may give you some kind of background as to why this study is taking place and so on and so forth. This is a great for you to understand and evaluate whether this is something of interest to you, right? Respond. You want to read deeply. So in other words, try to avoid distraction, right? It's sometimes, I don't know if this works for you, but I'm somebody that normally I have to read in quietness. I don't like to read with the TV on because I naturally get distracted, right? I'm not somebody who can sit there and read in a room full of people, right? Versus, I mean, some people can. My sister is one of those people. She can thrive in that type of environment. But for me, I like a more calming presence, right? That encourages me to read. But for her, it's a complete opposite, right? For her, when she is in a calming presence like that, it actually does not motivate her to read. It makes it harder because once again, she says that the silence, creeps her out. But nonetheless, I mean, that differs, right? Another way to respond is to annotate, right? So the idea here is to highlight, underline, make notes. You want to make notes in the margin. This is a great way to help summarize the ideas, but can also help you to make make connections and save time. So for instance, a lot of times, depending on the complexity of what you're reading, let's say you're reading a novel, there may be a lot of characters that are introduced in the beginning of the book. So it may be difficult to differentiate them, right? So therefore, by annotating, you can have an understanding. And if you, for instance, maybe you lose your footing in what it is that's going on, or maybe you need to go back to a particular part of the book to understand what you're currently reading, well, at least those notes are there to help guide you and navigate you, right? And when we talk about reading critically, you want to read literally, right? You want to read analytically and generate ideas. The idea here is that almost think of it like a conversation. It's a two-way street. Not only one of the things, I'm an avid reader and I love to read. One of the things that I feel is very helpful for me is to take it from the perspective that this author is writing something to me, right? I don't think about other people and how they perceive it. It's how I perceive it. To me, one of the things that I relish most is when I read a particular line or particular statement, and that truly touches me, right? Then it makes me see things in a completely different perspective, right? I truly believe in the power of words, and I feel like they have every potential to be able to break you. I mean, to make you and break you, right? So, so therefore, it's important that you really put yourself in everything that you read, right? When you are by taking that type of perspective, right? Maybe arguing with the book, maybe you don't agree with their perspective, maybe you don't agree with their ideas. This can help you engage more with it, right? And we're going to go a little more into detail about that. Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit about what consists of annotation. Okay. So annotation is textual. It's also known as marginia, right? It involves making notes or comments on readings and highlighting them. Like I said, finding those key points and evidence and other significant features. And the thing is that when we write notes, it's been actually documented by researchers that when we write things, we tend to remember things better. This is the reason why when you were in grade school and grammar school, they would have you write sentences, right? So for every definition, you were supposed to write it like 10 times. The idea is by writing it down repetitively, it can help for your mind to suck up that information, right? To remember it and recall it later. So why is this important? Well, this is important because you'll find that even like later on, let's say you haven't read that book in years and you go back to it, just by looking at those notes, it's like almost like a door opens and you remember immediately, oh, yes, I remember what this is, right? Because once again, as I mentioned, your mind is very much like any other muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it, right? You can work out and be completely fit, but if you take a year off, you're going to lose that body you work so hard to get, right? Same thing with reading. The more you read, the hungrier you get, meaning that the faster you're going to get, the better you're going to get. The more it will mean something to you, right? And there's challenges for you to do that. I highly encourage you guys to do something like that, right? Where read like a book once a month. The idea is that it feeds your brain, right? Studies show that actively annotating a text while you read helps to improve recalling information and enhancing that overall understanding. So this is the reason why it's important. So why do we annotate? As I mentioned, to identify key concepts, to monitor your learning as you read, to make, maybe it's for an exam, it can help to make your prepping more effective. It can be more efficient and create separate set of reading notes would be helpful when you annotate, right? But the idea here is for you to help you recall that information. Okay. So how exactly do you annotate, right? You can summarize keywords in your own, key points in your own words. Often, we may enjoy the way somebody says something, but by interpreting in our own ways can make it easier for us to digest it. So, for instance, I'm sure you guys have read poetry, right? But one of my favorite poets is Pablo Neruda, right? So one of his famous quotes, to the extent that, so I wait for you like a lonely house till you will see me again and live in me. Till then, my windows ache, right? The idea here is you think, well, that's kind of a difficult quote to remember, right? But it can mean different things to people. So for instance, it can demonstrate things like loss. It can demonstrate things like urge. This person has left a hollow part inside of them, right? I mean, there's a lot of interpretation for it. So the idea here is that really you get what you want out of a book, right? Although I can give you an assignment and encourage you to do something, the reality is that it's going to affect each person in a different way. Some people may not see it as a pearl, others might see it as a diamond, right? But the reality is by writing them in your own words, it can help to familiarize you and make you see it, make it almost your own, right? It gives you more accountability by putting it in your own words. When summarizing, you want to look for main ideas, arguments, and points of evidence, right? In addition, circling key concepts and phrases can also be helpful, right? It's helpful for if you feel like these are going to be important things for later, or in addition, if you, for instance, don't understand a concept or phrase given, you can look it up later, right? You want to write brief comments and questions in the margins, because once again, think of it almost like a conversation. Maybe there are a lot of innuendos that you don't quite understand, so therefore write those questions down in the book, so that way later on you can reflect and be like, oh yeah, I remember when they mentioned this, or etc., right? Use abbreviations and symbols. So for instance, you might want to use a question mark when you want to explore something further, or an exclamation mark if you find it interesting or something that you like, right? Or an asterisk, or anything that you might use an example or evidence for later, right? The idea here is by writing these notes, you can go back and recall what it is that you need, right? So this is great, for instance, when you are, I don't know, for your compare and contrast, or maybe your journal article. Your journal article is pretty much going to be asking for a thesis, giving me a summary of what it is that you read. So you not only have to create a thesis of what you think this author is talking about, but also find validated examples that help to support why it is you think they're talking about this subject, if that makes sense, right? And lastly, highlight and underline. So there's also something called the SQ4R method, right? This was developed in the 40s. It remains popular and an effective reading comprehension strategy, right? The name is an acronym indicating each step, which is to survey, question, read, reflect, recite, and review, right? So when we talk about surveying, right, this is when you're going to read things like the title or the chapter, the article. You're going to turn these, like the chapter and the article, into questions. So for instance, maybe it's given a very ominous title, like why is that titled that? What is the purpose of that, right? By asking these questions, you're already engaging in the material, right? It makes it more of interest. You want to read the headings and the subheadings and turn these also into questions. Read the introduction and summary to get an overview of the main ideas. Things like, for instance, reading the table of contents can also be helpful, right? So that way you have an understanding of where it's going to go, right? There's a reason why authors name a certain essay, why the title given, or there's a reason why a certain chapter is given that specific title, if that makes sense, right? When we talk about questions, question as you survey, right? Ask As you read each of the above parts, you want to ask yourself what is meant by the title, headings, subheadings, and captions, right? This is a great way, as I mentioned, for you to engage in the overall material. When we talk about reading, you want to actively read, as we discussed, right? Read carefully all the underlying italicized bold-faced words and phrases, right? They're intended to be there for a purpose. When we talk about reflecting, this is when you're using your critical thinking skills. This is when you're trying to fit in the information you already know. How can you use the information in your life, your career, your family? So for instance, we can find this in everything, right? I mean, the idea here is that this is supposed to be useful and encourage you, but I mean, there's so many different types of writing that can be helpful, right? So for instance, right now we're talking about reading comprehension, but the reality is, like, for instance, there's self-help books, there's books regarding habits, motivation books, books that talk about our internal depths as people, right? Next step is to recite. Recite immediately after an assignment, right? Use good judgment about places to stop and recite. So for instance, if you find that you're having difficulty with a paragraph or what have you, don't be afraid to read it aloud. Don't be afraid to summarize what it is that you just read to yourself, even if you're saying it quietly to yourself or you're saying it aloud, right? The idea here is that by summarizing it, you can have better recollection, right? So it's almost like this. When I was in high school, my organic chemistry teacher, she would allow us to have a index card, right? And that we could use during the exam. So, you know, you thinking that you're smart, or at least I thought I was smart. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna write so small and I'm gonna include all of these things. I'm gonna include all of these theories. I'm gonna use these formulas, et cetera, et cetera. And I filled it up with so much information. Like it took me like 2 days to do it, right? But what I found is that when I took the exam, I really didn't have to look at the note card. Here I was afraid of not including something and forgetting it, but the reality is by writing it and dedicating my time to writing all of that information, I wasn't directly learning it. So therefore, the exam actually happened really quickly. I didn't have to think or doubt myself. I just already knew the answers, if that makes sense. So it's almost like a reverse judicial thing that she did on us. But I mean, it was extremely helpful, right? So reciting can be helpful. In addition, engaging in conversation with a counterpart can also be a great way to help you retain the information. We find that when we teach information, it becomes easier for us to be able to recall that information. And lastly, review. Look over your outlines, what you've underlined, your notations. This is a great way for you to really, truly understand that information and engage in it. Okay? And lastly, tips to improving your reading comprehension. So just some tips, guys. One, never read a book without a pen in your hand. That's actually a quote by Benjamin Franklin. It's really great advice, right? The idea here is that you should always want to have a pen in your hand so that way you can make notes. That way you can, because the idea here is so sometimes we may perceive something from what's written that not even the author understood that they included in there, right? A lot of times they're like, oh, I never saw it like that. Great interpretation. This is the beauty of poetry, right? Particular person may write something for a certain purpose, but we really never know that purpose. So it's about how we envision and how those words, what those words mean to us, right? So the idea here is always be prepared. You never know what something of interest may come, right? Keep reading to get the bigger picture, right? So in other words, read the whole paragraph before you start like highlighting and, you know, writing notes or what have you. The idea here is that you don't want to stop reading in the midst of when a point is being made, right? You want to keep reading to get the bigger picture or context of what stood out to you. And then reread when you make your notes, okay? So that's very helpful because sometimes we get too into that. Have you ever seen somebody take notes? I've seen a couple of people like that. They'll have like a different pen for every subject taken, and what you realize is they're so busy trying to, you know, stay organized in the colors and what have you, and the rules that they've provided for themselves, that it makes it really hard for them to actually write effective notes, right? Because maybe the professor's going too quickly for them or what have you. So now they've only caught like 25% of everything when they should, be somewhere near like 90%. Right? You want to read silently with quick check marks, right? The idea here is that if there are many times when you should read silently and simply use a pencil to check sections of the margins, then you want to go back and read later. So you can use certain symbols, as we've talked about, right? Question mark would be a good one, an asterisk to tell you to go back later. Whatever works for you is the best way to go, right? As I mentioned, just one more thing I want to mention about reading aloud. It's also important to realize that when we read aloud, we read much slower than we do when we read silently. So sometimes by reading aloud, that can be a good thing because once again, you're not only hearing yourself speak, but you're also taking the time to focus more clearly on the words, right? So this makes our comprehension a little better because sometimes it's almost like sometimes when you read something, you may not exactly pay attention. Your mind is automatically already trying to interpret the words, right? But by reading out loud, you can say, oh, no, that doesn't make sense. Sometimes we confuse a certain word for another word, right? I mean, I'm sure this has happened to you at the store, right? You think something is, I don't know, $4.99, it's actually $14.99. Maybe your mind just missed the one for that second, right? That's an example of that. Explain what you read. When you finish a chapter or section of a book, take a break and think about what it is that you've read. You can also explain this to someone. That's a great way to, truly understand the information given. The idea here is to see if you can structure your thoughts and be able to repeat it back to somebody, maybe the information that you just read. The more you can recall it, that means the more engaged you are with the material, right? It's a great exercise and makes it very helpful for you to understand what it is that you read. Lastly, you want to learn to X-ray. So this would be like very much like we already talked about, reviewing things like the table of contents, looking at headings, subheadings, introduction, summaries. This is examples of that. By having a better understanding of what it is you're about to read, it can make that overall understanding more clear. Circle, underline words that you don't know. By circling and underlining, we're just making small reminders of what it is we want to look at, right? It's great for memory recognition. As I mentioned, mark words you don't know. Don't be afraid to look them up. The idea here is that often we close ourselves off to things, right? We often assume that we know everything, and the reality is that the smartest person understands that they know nothing, right? It's only by being open to experiences, being open to learning, that we can grow as people, and that's the overall objective for anybody, right? Any questions, guys? Okay, I feel like this was a pretty easy lecture, not too much to know here, but if we go back, let me ask you, which of the following is a tip of reading comprehension, right? You can pick any of these and just, right, learning to X-ray, right? So there'll be an example of that, right? And maybe I may ask you, what does the SQ4 method stand for? And then you would tell me what each one stands for, right? So that would be an example of that. Okay, so they're pretty easy questions that would be consisting of your exam. Like I said, it's just intended to, help to accrue points that are not entirely reliant on your writing. Okay. So I do realize I have a question slide and nobody can ask questions, but for instance, if you do have any questions, you are more than welcome to contact me. As I mentioned in the introduction, guys, I'm here to empower you. I'm here to facilitate this information to make your lives easier, not harder. Okay, so any questions that you have, I'm sure other people have that same question. So by all means, I'm a very approachable person. I am happy to help. Let me know how I can assist. Okay, and with that, we are done. Have a good week, and please do not forget about your 2 upcoming assignments that are due on Sunday by 11:59. That's September 1st. You have your discussion, meet and greet, and you have your reading comprehension assignment. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. Bye.